Hey, Campfire crew, let's get it on. The Man Who Came to Check In by Anonymous. This happened about 15 years ago, but my sister and I still talk about it sometimes. At the time, I was 16 and my sister was 18. We lived in a single-parent household, so my mom worked a lot to keep us afloat. We were used to being on our own pretty often. We lived just on the edge of a small city in a quiet area. It wasn't exactly rural, but the houses on our street were spaced out, separated by long stretches of dry grass and trees. We had a long gravel driveway that curved from the street up to our house, which meant you couldn't really see the street or other houses from the front windows. We had a large front yard with a lot of trees that provided a lot of privacy. Maybe too much. Our mom had decided to go on a week-long trip to stay with her aunt on the coast, so it was just me and my sister. The first 2 or 3 days were uneventful. I went to school. My sister went to work. We came home and mostly spent the evenings fighting over who was going to use the computer. We were poor and only had one, with good old dial-up. The following night, though, something strange happened. Just as it was beginning to get dark, I was in the lounge room while my sister was on the computer in the office, when I heard a car slowly coming up the driveway. At first I thought it was my mom coming home early, but it didn't sound like her car. I was able to get a view of the car from where I was sitting on the couch through the window, but I didn't recognize it. It was old and faded, and I couldn't make out the driver through the windows. I waited, watching as the car pulled up to a stop just outside the house. After a minute, the driver's side door opened and a man who looked to be in his 50s, and I was young, everybody looked old back then, got out. He stood by the car for a few seconds looking up at the house and then slowly made his way up the veranda and to the front of the house. By now I was feeling uneasy. I definitely didn't recognize this man, and my mom wasn't home. I felt almost frozen. I didn't know if my sister was aware of this happening, and at that moment I didn't want to yell out to her to make myself known to this man. I just stood there, not knowing what to do. He got to the door and knocked. I tiptoed to the office to get my sister, who looked equally as uneasy. We stood there, watching the door, neither one of us wanting to answer it. Even though I'm the youngest, my sister was quite reserved compared to me, so after a few moments I worked up the courage to open the door just a crack. Luckily we had a chain, so I made sure to fasten it before I opened the door and said, "Can I help you?" The man gave me a friendly smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there," he said. "I'm just here to check in on the place. Your mom asked me to stop by, make sure everything was okay while she's away." At that age, I was pretty naive and trusting, but something about this guy was off. Whether it was his voice, the way he looked, how he moved so slowly. But what didn't sit right with me is that we had spoken to my mom that morning. She didn't mention anyone coming by to check up on us, and she's the overly protective type. You know, telling us everything twice, asking several times if this or that is okay, water the garden, keep the doors locked, etc. She definitely made no mention of this. My heart sank. I looked back at my sister, who was hiding a few steps behind me, frozen. "I think you have the wrong house," I said. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of why he was there and what he really wanted. But the man didn't budge. Instead, he kept that same unconvincing smile, eyes transfixed on me. My heart was racing. "No mistake," he replied smoothly. "Your mom told me you'd be here. Just wanted someone to keep an eye on things." His eyes moved from mine over my shoulder, his gaze lingering a bit too long on the interior of the house, like he was mapping it out. Then he said, "It's nothing to worry about. Do you mind if I come in just for a quick look?" Everything inside me was screaming to shut the door, but I was terrified of angering him, scared of what he might do if I provoked him. I knew this wasn't some friendly neighbor. It was the way he held himself, so calm as if he knew he'd get his way. I felt this sick sense of dread in my stomach, like we'd been caught in some trap we didn't even know existed. I shook my head, trying to sound firm but polite. "No, sorry, I think you should leave." The man's smile faded a little. After a pause, he raised his hand slightly and stepped back. I started to close the door, but before I could, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Are you sure about that?" The way he said it, so casual yet so unsettling, made my skin crawl. I managed to close the door, but my hands were shaking. My sister and I stood there in silence, frozen, listening, waiting, until we finally heard his footsteps recede and his car start up. For what felt like a lifetime, my sister and I just stood in the doorway, unable to speak or move. It was silence. I kept running his words over in my head, that strange, probing tone, like he was daring me to let him in. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd come there for something specific, and we'd somehow thrown him off. When we were finally able to move, ever so quietly, as if he'd come back if he heard us, we made our way around the house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. I still didn't feel safe, and I barely slept, in my sister's room, of course, until my mom returned. We never saw that man again, but to this day, that event still gives me nightmares. What troubles me the most is that man knew my mom was away, knew we'd be home. How? I've never been able to answer that question. Whoever you were, man at the door to my house, let's not meet again. The Haunted Clock by Lynn Jahaha. This didn't happen to me, but to my late husband, John, back when he was 16 years old. In 1962, his mother, Mary, was recently widowed for a couple of years when she remarried a guy named Tom. They moved into a house in Eastlake, Ohio. It was your average, normal-sized home with 3 bedrooms. Of course, Mary had a lot of personal possessions from her late husband, Chuck. One of them was a beautiful solid oak mantel clock from the Black Forest in Germany. Chuck treasured that clock and took immaculate care of it, making sure to always keep it wound up to chime on the hour. When he became very ill and knew he didn't have long, he told her that after he went, he wanted her to keep that clock wound, to never let it run down, and if she did, he jokingly said he would come back to haunt her. Well, they set up housekeeping in their new residence. John was 16 and his sister Beth was 12. For a while, Mary or John would wind the clock. However, they were still arranging everything in the house as well as getting new items, such as new furniture. On top of that, John and Beth were going to new schools, making new friends, etc., etc. Not quite 1 year into settling into the new house, they neglected to wind the clock. This clock was very Bavarian in appearance, with ornate scrolled woodwork all around the face, with flowers and birds on either side. Under the clock face was the area where the pendulum swung back and forth, and it had a maple leaf on the bottom of it. One day, while they were having dinner and conversation, the clock began chiming. It hadn't been wound. This perplexed them, but they just brushed it off as a fluke. However, the clock kept chiming on the hour. Determined to figure the mystery out, John and Tom began inspecting it to see if there was something mechanical that they may have overlooked. They couldn't find any mechanical cause to account for it. However, they still didn't wind it since the key had been misplaced after they moved in, and they couldn't find it. They still had some boxes that were packed because they had to figure out where to put certain items. But the clock remained silent the rest of the day. It began chiming around 2 in the morning, much to their dismay and confusion. They stuck it in a linen closet in a box, thinking that would resolve the issue. However, the clock began chiming every hour on the hour. Mary was beginning to get quite upset about it. She started to think it was haunted by her late husband, Chuck. He said he would haunt them if they didn't keep it wound. John poo-pooed that idea. He didn't think an item could be haunted. To make sure it wouldn't chime anymore, he removed the pendulum and put it back in the box at the back of the linen closet. Problem solved. Or so he thought. The clock began chiming a couple of hours later. They couldn't believe it. John pulled the clock out of the box in the closet, only to observe that even though the pendulum had been removed, the little arm that the pendulum was mounted on was ticking back and forth. He showed that to everyone. By this time, Mary was in tears. She just couldn't stand it anymore. The clock began to depress her as it reminded her of Chuck. Also, the fact that it appeared to really be haunted unnerved everyone. The decision was made to sell it. Within a week, the clock was sold to someone and taken out of the house. John and Mary told me that they always wondered if the clock continued its unusual behavior after it was removed from them and the house. Or did Chuck go along with it? He, Mary Beth, and Tom did not believe that the clock was haunted. They didn't hear anything about it after that, and didn't really want to know. Some things are better left alone in the long run. I Think Something Chased Me by Tiny Information. It was summer. I think it was late June, and I decided to go take a ride with my bike. I chose a road where people rarely drive, even in the daytime. You could tell it's rarely used because of the clean asphalt and road markings. It looked like someone just put it there yesterday, even though it was poured 6 years ago. The sidewalks were getting overgrown by weeds. The road was 4 lanes wide. We didn't have streetlights out there. Trees were covering the road, really big trees, and they were very old. There were a few houses out there, but only a few, and it looked like no one lived there, because I'd never seen anyone in the area. The road had a slow climb, then gradually became steep. There was also an abandoned factory out there, and I chose that place because I loved the feel of the smooth asphalt. I rode a road bike. I think it was around 10:40 or 11 p.m., and I passed the entrance of the road which leads to the abandoned factory. I didn't like the feel of the factory, so I changed my RPMs to get out of that place and get to the sweet, smooth asphalt. 200 meters in, the road was empty. I knew I was the only one in that area, but I had a gut feeling that I was not. I just ignored it because I'm ignorant. I used my phone attachment to my drop bars as a light. It was chilly out, maybe 16 degrees Celsius, and kind of foggy, but only a little. I reached the end of the road which no longer had the nice asphalt on it, and just a few meters by there was a park. A really bad park. It wasn't maintained properly, and the grass was ugly. I came to my senses and realized how late it was. The place was known for crimes in the town. Murders, muggers, drugs, angry drunk dudes. One time a sack of a mutilated, nearly decomposing man had been thrown in the bushes. So as a perfectly normal human being, I decided I'd had my fun and decided to go home. I clipped my cleats into the pedals and used the momentum of downhill to get out of there as fast as possible. I was on my way out of that place, doing maybe 24 kilometers an hour. As I was going down, I caught a glimpse of a figure using my phone light. The range was bad, but I am sure I saw something. I started pedaling really fast. I became Mark Cavendish that night. But I had to watch my speed, as there was a sharp left turn coming up. The wind was blowing in my ears, and I started to hear really heavy footsteps coming from behind me. Really heavy on the pavement. I was fucking terrified. I was panicking. I had nothing else in my mind except to get out of that place fast. After the sharp left turn, there was a hill, and I knew I would lose my momentum. I shifted gears on my bike, 105 10-speed, and I pedaled till I got out to the entrance. There was a light after the entrance, and I felt like nothing was chasing me after that. I managed to get out of there. My home was another 10 kilometers away. I was tired and disoriented, but I was thinking about what I saw. Luckily, I didn't feel alone anymore because now some cars were passing by. To this day, I think of what I saw. Did I really see something, and something chased me? Or did I think I saw something, and my brain made me hear things in confusion? Uncle Josh note. Nice Mark Cavendish reference. Former cyclist here. I still have 5 of my bikes, and I rarely ride. More of a mountain bike racer, but I also had a Shimano 105 road bike. Never rich enough to own Ultegra or Dura-Ace, but love the name Mark. He was a great rider, fast as hell. Really cool reference. Thanks for mentioning him. Pretend Millionaire Might Have Tried to Abduct Me by Open Caregiver. This happened a few years ago, a little less than a year after COVID started. But I was talking about it with some friends, and looking back, this story seems pretty scary right now. I had gotten a promotion at work, but had to move several hundred miles away from family and friends to a new area. The job paid pretty well, but I got scammed by some moving brokers and had a medical incident that gave me lots of bills to take care of. Given that it was hard to make friends when lockdown was happening, I decided to get a weekend job to pay down those bills faster since I didn't have much to do outside of my main job. I ended up hitting it off with a guy who was a manager at a local paint store. He said weekends were pretty light since most of their business was during the week, and weekends were mainly for people who weren't painters for a living or people picking up orders. So most of the time I just played my Switch, read, or watched stuff. I was usually either by myself or had one other person there with me. If another person was there, I was usually out front and he was in the back counting inventory or playing his Switch or watching stuff. One day, a guy pulled in an interesting vehicle, which was a school bus spray-painted with white primer and no plates. I didn't think much of it at the time because in that field you see a lot of weird vehicles people work from, such as cars with multiple donuts instead of tires, minivans missing doors, or cars that were 90% rust and 10% hope, with duct tape keeping it all together. So, this guy came in and was going through our color options and started asking me a bunch of questions while he was doing so. I tried asking him what he was painting or what general color he was looking for, but he would just say he was doing a paint project for a client. He didn't say a certain color, and he was looking at every color in our book, which seemed odd, since if it was for a client, I imagined they would have had at least given a broad color like red or gray for him to get. He then said, "I do good work, which is why I'm a millionaire," and then he gave me his card. The card seemed weird. It felt just like regular cardstock and was misshapen too, as if he had printed them out at home and then cut them himself, which he probably did. He kept asking me more about myself and focused on me not being from the area. He knew I wasn't because he saw my car out front and noticed the plates were out of state, and kept asking me about that. He also kept shoehorning in how he was a millionaire and that I could learn a lot from him. He also kept bringing up how he figured he was one of our biggest customers, since he probably spent a few thousand there a year in paint. Finally, he decided on a paint. He went with basic white, so no mixing, and he wanted to pay in cash. He didn't have a store account with us, nor did he want to open one, which seemed odd for a guy whose business is apparently so critical to us, and the company gave a significant discount for business accounts. He got our biggest size container, so I had to wheel it out for him. And this is where it all went down. I brought things out to the bus, and he got in the driver's seat and just pointed to the back. He expected me to load it up for him, which I normally did for people, but company policy was we weren't supposed to since they didn't want to be liable if we got hurt. And there's also a difference between helping a person load their trunk or truck and going up steps and into the back of a school bus. I started looking at the inside, and the steps were covered in various things, and the floor to the back was also covered in various tools and things which just looked unsafe. Then I noticed to his left side, he had a baseball bat and a gun that his left hand was suspiciously close to. I got nervous and said, "Sorry, company policy is I'm only supposed to bring it to the parking lot. I'm not supposed to handle it from there." And then I ran back inside. He then just sat in the bus for a bit, and I texted my coworker in the back that something felt off, and that if the guy didn't leave, we should call the police. Well, the guy waited there for about 15 minutes or so, and then ran into the store screaming at me. He was screaming, "I'm a millionaire! Why didn't you load the bus for me? I'm a millionaire! I deserve more respect than this!" And I noticed that the gun that was sitting on the floor of the bus was now in his jacket. I just responded with, "Company policy is that we can't load vehicles for people, and we aren't supposed to get inside them either. There were a lot of tripping hazards in there, too. I'm telling you, it doesn't feel safe." That triggered him, and he started screaming, "I'm a millionaire! You should feel safe with me! I deserve respect!" Then my coworker in the back heard him yelling and came out and asked what was going on. The guy immediately ran out and drove away. We called the police, and they took our statements, and we started looking at the business card he gave. The name was fake, I couldn't find the business anywhere online, and the address was for a GNC in a strip mall. We gave the police his description and the description of the bus, and they took our very grainy surveillance camera footage too, but they never found him. Looking back, it definitely felt like he was going to kidnap me, or just had serious issues. Our company now specifically uses that scenario in training, and has been on the lookout for him ever since. Weird Ice Cream Truck by Carcinocat. My grandma owns a cabin on a lake in northern Michigan that I visit every year with all of my cousins. There are 8 other houses in our community, and each one has been in their family for generations. Long story short, the other kids from the other 8 houses have been my best friends since I was born. During the summers, at night, we'd all meet at the crossroads to play flashlight games. The summer I was 14, the strangest thing happened. I'm on the older side of the group. There is a girl who's a year older than me, but the majority of the kids are younger. The youngest that specific summer was 8. Sometimes the younger kids would get scared, so pretty early on we made an emergency code word in case one of them got too scared during our games. They'd call it out, and we'd stop the game no matter what and find them. One night, it was 11:23 p.m., and I vividly remember looking at my watch. It was nearly pitch black, and we were playing sardines. We had just started a new game, so there was only one person hiding, and the rest of us were wandering around searching for them, when we heard ice cream truck music. It stands to say that our community is 7 miles from the nearest town. We know all the other kids in about a 2-mile radius, and all of them were definitely not out and about. They were all very young at the time, like 5 and under, and we knew that no one owned an ice cream truck anywhere near us. Why would they? Our community is private, and it has a long mile driveway, so there would be no point in selling to us, and there are hardly any other families around for a few miles. There's no reason why a person would be driving an ice cream truck around in the middle of the day, let alone in the middle of the night. We heard the ice cream truck music floating over the trees, and the oldest girl and I looked at each other and instantly used our emergency word, calling all the kids back to the crossroads. We did a head count, and everyone was there. We all listened to the music gradually get closer and louder, and truth be told, we were all terrified. It went on for about a minute, but it seemed like a lot longer. Then suddenly, it stopped, and the woods around us were dead silent. Usually, we could hear animals or crickets in the trees, but after that music, there was nothing. We called our game quits after that. The oldest girl and I walked all of our friends home just to make sure because we were all pretty freaked. The next night, we heard it again at the exact same time, 11:23. We called everyone in again and it got louder and stopped about a minute after it started. We didn't hear it after that. It's been about 6 years since then, but it still freaks me out to this day, and the kids who we were playing with still remember it. The Man in the Roof by Rederico. This happened about 3 years ago when I was 14 or 15. At the time I was making pocket money by mowing the lawn at my mom's condominium. The lawnmower was kept in a small storage building where only I and the landlord had keys. Some backstory about the building. It didn't have any windows and only one door. It consisted of only one room where the lawnmower and other gardening stuff was kept. The building's inner and outer roof had a small space in between it. I wouldn't call it an attic, it was just a space. The inside roof was made of only spare planks, which meant you could see into said space. One Sunday, I needed to mow the lawn, so I took the keys and headed to the storage building. The door was locked as usual, so I opened it with the keys, stepped in, and with no particular reason, I looked up. My heart dropped. Up there on those rickety planks, there was a man, just looking down. I only looked up for a second or two, and he looked back at me. His clothes were dirty and his face was covered in scars. I didn't want him to do anything, so I pretended as if I hadn't seen him. I took the lawnmower, walked out the door, and closed it behind me. I immediately ran to our apartment and called the police, who arrived in about 5 minutes. The police went in, and a couple of minutes later they brought out the man in handcuffs. The man had been trying to climb back into the roof while holding a pair of gardening shears. Truly horrifying. Who knows what could have happened if I didn't look up while entering the storage building. My mom and I moved out sometime later. Man in the roof? Let's not meet. Scary Encounter with Something by Star Loser. So, I live in the southeastern corner of South Dakota. There aren't a lot of wooded areas down here, but there are some. My boyfriend and I have been spending lots of time exploring the few wooded areas that we have. Yesterday, we went to this one area, and we would not have expected anything to happen because it was still decently close to the town of Brandon. If anything, our concern would have been about people. This park and wooded area has lots of things to explore for it, and we brought one of my boyfriend's friends with us. We were more intense with our hikes than he was, so he let us leave him behind and we went exploring off the beaten trail and did our own thing. By the time we were getting back to the area that we had left him in, the sun was starting to set and he wasn't there, so we called him up and he said he was headed back to the car. It's important to note that during this time we were making these screams back and forth at each other, trying to see if we could hear each other beyond the phone. My boyfriend and I had one more trail we wanted to explore, so we headed down that trail, and then eventually it got dark, so we made it back to the trail that took us back to the car. We were walking through the woods and joking about how our friend was probably going to try to scare us or some shit. We saw a deer and didn't think anything of it, but it did slightly startle me. Finally, we made it to the area where the woods started to turn to the prairie, and we heard this scream, and then saw a really fast deer jump through a tree that was split into 2 branches. I don't know a good way to explain that tree layout, but we, being logical, started calling out to our friend, being like, "Hey, you got us, not funny." But it clearly wasn't our friend. We were a little on edge after that, but just picking up our pace getting to the car. My boyfriend and I took turns looking back behind us, and I saw what looked like an obese man just kind of standing on the trail behind us. but whatever it was had more of a ghost-like presence to it than an actual man. My boyfriend looked back at another point and said, "Hey, I don't want to scare you, but it almost looks like there's a person back there or something." My face dropped, and I said word for word, "You saw it too?" And then we just kind of looked at each other and ran. We ended up taking the wrong path, so we had to run a lot longer, but we eventually made it back to the car. Our friend was there, and he swore on his life that he wasn't fucking with us. Either way, there was no way that dude could have run that fast or looked like what we saw behind us. When we got home, we started to look stuff up. We think what we saw could have been a skinwalker, but this is South Dakota, and we're on Lakota Sioux land, not Navajo land. Either way, it was a very creepy experience. The Door by Subparadult. I lived in the Appalachian Mountains my whole life, where the woods are thick, tangled, and full of mystery. Growing up there felt like stepping back in time. We had no cell phones or gadgets to distract us, just the endless expanse of forest as our playground and our imaginations as our guide. My best friend Madison and I would spend hours exploring the dense woods behind my house, following animal tracks, climbing trees, and discovering hidden creeks. In autumn, when the leaves turned fiery shades and fell, revealing clearer paths, we'd push a little deeper each day. We'd mark our bases in the most secret nooks we stumbled upon, pretending we were the first explorers to find them. But no matter how brave we felt, we always stayed close enough to see my house in the distance. Until one day, when the forest felt just a little more inviting, a little less ordinary, and curiosity got the better of us. We brought twine and other supplies that day, winding it around tree trunks so we'd find our way back. We kept walking deeper than we'd ever gone before until we reached a strange old tree that split in two, like a giant slingshot rising from the ground. Right next to it, half hidden in the hillside beneath a pile of leaves and branches, was a rusty handle. As we brushed away the leaves, we realized it was attached to a heavy wooden door, embedded in the earth as if it had always been there, waiting. Heart pounding, Madison and I both tugged on the handle, and the door finally broke open, revealing steps leading down into pitch blackness. Madison looked at me unsure, but we felt compelled to go down. Maybe it was the mystery or the thrill of finding something forgotten, but we didn't hesitate. The air was thick and damp as we descended. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a cramped room. In the middle of the floor lay a single worn photograph. I held it up to our flashlight and froze. It showed two children, both girls, standing in front of a house that looked eerily like mine. The girls' eyes were so dark, and their grins were twisted, a little too wide. Madison and I looked at each other, panicked, and then bolted back up the steps, leaving the photo behind us. When we reached the top, we looked around, and our path of twine was gone, as if someone or something had unraveled it. We blindly ran back through the forest, finally reaching my house, and we burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed. My parents immediately noticed something was wrong, and we tried to explain what we found. The strange little door in the hillside, the steps, and the photograph. My mom's face tightened with concern, but my dad, always the skeptic, shook his head and laughed. But when he saw how serious we were, they agreed to come with us, though I could tell they thought it was just a kid's overactive imagination. With my parents in tow, we spent what felt like hours retracing our steps through the woods, following what we remembered of the path. We finally spotted the twisted slingshot-shaped tree standing exactly where we'd found it before, and my heart leapt. But when we scoured the area around it, there was no sign of the door. No rusty handle, no disturbed leaves, just bare earth and untouched forest floor. It was like the whole thing had never existed. My dad muttered something about kids and their stories, but as we walked back home, I caught a worried look in my mom's eyes. Madison and I exchanged a glance too, and in that moment, we knew we'd experienced something no one would ever believe. Even now, 15 years later, Madison and I can't shake the memory of that day. We've gone back to those woods more than once, trying to find any trace of that hidden door, but it's as if it never existed. We have no explanation for what we saw, no way to make sense of it. Every time I visit home and glance up at the woods, a chill creeps up my spine, and I almost expect to see the door waiting there, half buried and forgotten, just as we left it. And no matter how hard I try, I can still see that eerie photo in my mind. The eyes, the strange grins, like they're burned into my memory. Entity Following Us at 3 a.m. by Soft Permission. It was Halloween night, and me, a 15-year-old male, and my cousins, 14 and 15-year-old males, decided to sneak out around 3 a.m. to go down to the shop, and all was going well until we got about one-third of the way home. We were outside a church, and my cousin, a 15-year-old, saw an elderly woman, maybe in her 70s. She was holding a shopping bag and had brown curly hair down past her shoulders. By the way, we live in Ireland, so we call it Samhain. We walked for 5 minutes until my other cousin, the 14-year-old, said to me, "There's a woman following us." And I turned around, and sure enough, the old woman was following us. We started speed walking, so she didn't think we were running away from her. And that's when she started running at us. At that point, we were scared shitless because it was 3 a.m. in Ireland on Samhain, and this old lady was in her 70s, chasing us. We started running for our lives, and she kept running until she turned into my granny's yard, which was really creepy since she was the only one who lived there. We made it home without anything serious happening, but we decided to tell ChatGPT what happened to us, and this is what it said. 1. The witching hour. 3 a.m. is thought to heighten supernatural activity. An old woman's appearance may be linked to this time. 2. Old hag sleep paralysis. The old hag often appears during sleep paralysis, causing fear and immobility. 3. Banshee. In Irish and Scottish lore, a banshee, sometimes an old woman, warns of death and may follow a person as an omen. 4. Ghostly apparition. Elderly spirits might appear due to unresolved issues or to warn, protect, or seek help. 5. Warning spirit. Some believers see these apparitions as warnings of danger or illness. Many cultures recommend prayers, amulets, or cleansing rituals to protect them. Now we were freaking out even more when it mentioned all of that, so we decided to ask it more about banshees, and ChatGPT said that they follow their victims as a warning sign. They should be doing something, or that someone in their family is going to die. The next day, when all of my cousins left, I heard news that a friend of my granny and mother had recently died due to cancer. I didn't even know about it until that day, the day she died. And she was in her 70s. I know most of you probably think this is BS, or was just an old woman. But I believe she was more than that. Because, first of all, why would an old woman be out at 3 a.m. following a group of teenage boys? Why would she run at us? 3 a.m. on Halloween night in Ireland. We're the second most haunted country in the world behind Germany. That's according to Google. Anyway, let me know what you guys think this was. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or on the podcast, email it to UncleJoshTrueScaryStories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you are so inclined, please give this video a like. Leave a comment below. I'd love to know what you think about the stories. Maybe even subscribe to the channel and tell your friends about it. Follow me on social media. There's links to that in the description. And if you'd like to take your support of the channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page down there, or consider purchasing some of my Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. There's a link to my storefront at tpublic.com. More designs on the way, and the one that seems to be most popular has absolutely nothing to do with this channel. It's a Star Wars spoof of a planet that's been blown up with the words, "Alderaan deserved it." Inside joke if you don't like Star Wars. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.